In this code snippet, we're exploring how PHP handles extremely large numeric values and how it determines whether a number is finite or infinite. When numbers go beyond the range that PHP can represent as a normal float, the language automatically converts them into a special value called infinity, represented as INF. This example demonstrates that behavior in action and helps us understand how to check and handle such cases properly in PHP. The snippet assigns the number 2.9E532 to a variable and prints it with var dump. In plain terms, 2.9E532 means 2.9 times 10 to the power of 532, an astronomically large value. PHP stores floating point numbers using the platform's native double precision format, and that format has an upper limit. When you try to store a number larger than that limit, PHP cannot represent it as a normal finite float. Instead, the language represents the result as infinity, which var dump displays as float INF. Seeing float INF is not an error message, but a signal. The value overflowed the capacity of the float type. This happens quietly. PHP converts the value to the special IEE representation for infinity rather than throwing an exception. That is why var dump still reports the variable's type as float, but its value is the special infinity marker. For someone reading program output, this is an immediate clue that the numeric magnitude exceeded what floating point can hold. If your code needs to detect this situation programmatically, PHP provides built-in checks. Is infinite, X returns true when the value is infinity, and is finite, X returns false in the same case. There is also isNaN X to detect not a number results. Using these checks lets your program handle edge cases explicitly. For example, to log a warning, switch to a fallback routine, or sanitize user input before mathematical operations. For applications that must work with extremely large or very precise numbers, floats are the wrong tool. Floating point arithmetic is fast and convenient, but limited in range and precision. PHP offers arbitrary precision libraries such as BCMath for decimal arithmetic as strings or GMP for big integers. These libraries do not convert huge values into infinity. They store numbers exactly within available memory and let you perform safe arithmetic operations without overflow into special floating values. When designing software that might face very large numbers, consider defensive programming patterns. Validate inputs early, compare values against PHP float max if you are constrained to floats, and always check is infinite after important calculations. If you accept numeric input from external sources, add explicit bounds or convert those inputs to arbitrary precision types before performing critical computations. This reduces surprising behavior and makes your code more robust and predictable. Finally, remember performance trade-offs. Arbitrary precision arithmetic is slower and uses more memory than native floating point. Choose the right tool for the job. Floats for performance when magnitudes stay within normal ranges, and BCMath or GMP when correctness and precision for huge numbers matter more than raw speed. By detecting infinities and switching strategies when needed, you can provide both reliability and efficiency in your applications. Now, let's move on to another special numeric value in PHP called NaN, which stands for not a number. The term NaN is used to describe a situation where a mathematical operation cannot produce a valid numeric result. In other words, it indicates that the result of a calculation is undefined or mathematically impossible to represent as a real number. PHP provides a built-in function called isNaN to help us check whether a value is a valid number or not. In the code snippet shown here, we are using the ACOS function, which calculates the arccosine of a number. Normally, the valid range for ACOS is from 1 to 1 because those are the only possible cosine values that exist in mathematics. But in this example, we are passing the value 25 to the function, which is far outside that range. Since the cosine of 25 does not exist, PHP cannot return a valid numeric result. Instead, it returns a special value called NaN, indicating that the result is not a number. When we use var dump lx to inspect the value, PHP displays float nan. This tells us that AX is a floating point variable, but its value is undefined. It's a representation of something that cannot be expressed as a real numeric value within normal mathematical rules. This is very useful in programming because it helps us identify when calculations go wrong or when an invalid input has been passed to a mathematical function. To handle such cases properly, you can use the isNumber function in PHP. This function returns true if the given variable contains a nan value, allowing you to detect the problem and take corrective action in your code. For example, by showing an error message, substituting a default value, or skipping the invalid calculation. Handling nan values correctly is essential for building reliable mathematical or scientific applications in PHP, as it prevents unexpected results from propagating through your code. Next, let's look at another important concept in PHP: numerical strings. In PHP, a variable can contain either a numeric value or a string that looks like a number. To check whether a variable is numeric, PHP provides a built-in function called isNumeric. This function returns true if the variable's value is either an actual number or a string that represents a valid number. If it's not numeric, the function returns false. This check is very useful when your data comes from user input or external sources, where numeric values may arrive as strings instead of pure numbers. In the code example shown here, we have several variables being tested using the isNumeric function. The first variable, a, is assigned the number 5985. When we pass it to isNumeric a, PHP correctly recognizes it as a number and returns true. The second variable, b, is a string, but notice that it contains the characters 5985, which look like a valid number. PHP treats this as a numeric string, so isNumeric b also returns true. In the third case, c is defined as 59.85 plus 100. Even though the first part is a string, PHP automatically converts it into a number before performing the addition. The result becomes a valid numeric value, so when we check isNumeric c, the function again returns true. This shows PHP's flexibility in handling mathematical operations, even when some inputs start as strings. Finally, the fourth variable, dd, is assigned the string hello. Since this clearly isn't a number or something that can be converted into one, isNumeric d returns false. This demonstrates how PHP differentiates between numeric values and regular text. In short, the isNumeric function helps ensure your program deals safely with numbers, especially when handling user input from forms or APIs where values might be entered as text. It prevents unexpected behavior during calculations and makes your code more reliable and secure. By checking whether a variable is truly numeric before performing operations, you can avoid errors and make your PHP scripts more robust. Now let's move to another fundamental concept in PHP: type conversion and casting. One of the powerful features of PHP is its ability to automatically convert data types during program execution. This means that PHP is a loosely typed language, so you don't have to declare the data type of a variable explicitly before using it. For example, if a variable initially holds an integer value and later you assign a string to the same variable, PHP automatically changes its type from integer to string at runtime. This flexibility makes coding easier and faster, especially for beginners, because PHP handles most of the type conversions behind the scenes. However, while automatic type conversion is convenient, it can sometimes lead to unexpected behavior or errors. Imagine you're performing arithmetic operations on values that were originally stored as strings. PHP will attempt to convert them into numbers automatically. In many cases, this works fine, but in others, it might cause logical errors or data corruption if the values cannot be properly converted. That's why developers need to understand when PHP performs these automatic conversions and when to intervene manually. In some situations, you may want to control how and when a value's type changes. This is where explicit type casting comes in. Casting means forcing a variable to change its type intentionally. For example, you can convert a float into an integer or an integer into a string by using PHP's built-in casting syntax or type conversion functions. This helps make your code predictable and ensures that calculations, string operations, or comparisons behave exactly as you expect. PHP provides several built-in ways to perform typecasting. You can use syntax like int variable to convert a value into an integer, float variable to turn it into a floating point number, or string variable to convert it into text. These conversions help you maintain full control over your data types, especially in cases where automatic type juggling might produce confusing results. In summary, PHP's automatic type conversion is a convenient feature that saves time and reduces boilerplate code, but it's important to use it wisely. Whenever accuracy and data consistency matter, especially in mathematical or database operations, explicit casting is a safer and more reliable choice. By understanding both automatic and manual conversions, you can write cleaner, more stable, and more predictable PHP programs. Now let's understand how PHP converts other data types, especially strings, into floats. In PHP, this process is very straightforward because the language is dynamically typed and performs many conversions automatically. A float, also known as a floating point number, is simply a number that can contain decimal points. For example, numbers like 12.5 or 314 are floats. PHP allows strings, which are sequences of characters, to be converted into floats when necessary, especially when performing mathematical operations. If a string contains numeric characters, such as 25.75, PHP can automatically interpret it as a floating point number whenever it's used in a calculation. This is known as implicit type conversion, meaning the conversion happens automatically without the need for explicit commands. In most cases, developers don't have to manually convert strings to floats because PHP does it behind the scenes during runtime. For example, if you write 2575 plus 4, PHP will understand that the string represents a number and convert it to a float before performing the addition. The result would be 29.75, a valid float value. However, there are times when you may want to explicitly convert a string into a float to ensure accuracy or to make your code more readable. You can do this using casting syntax by writing float variable or double variable. This approach is especially useful when you are processing user inputs, form data, or data coming from external APIs, where numbers often arrive as text. Converting these strings explicitly helps avoid unexpected results, especially when the string includes extra characters or formatting symbols that could confuse PHP's automatic conversion. In essence, PHP's flexibility with type conversion makes it easier for developers to work with mixed data types. Whether it's implicit conversion done automatically or explicit casting performed manually, the goal is the same: to make sure values are in the right format for arithmetic or logical operations. By understanding how PHP converts strings to floats, you can write cleaner, more reliable code that behaves consistently across different situations. Now that we understand how PHP can convert strings into floats automatically, let's look at one of the most common and reliable methods for doing it manually, the floatval function. This built-in PHP function is specifically designed to extract or convert a numeric value from a variable and represent it as a floating point number. When you pass a string, integer, or any other numeric-like value into this function, it returns the floating point equivalent. Essentially, PHP takes the value of the variable you provide, reads its numeric content, and converts it into a float that can then be used in mathematical operations or calculations. The syntax for using this function is very simple. You just write floatvar, floatval, stringvar. Here, stringvar is the variable that contains your numeric string. For example, 45.67. When you pass it to the floatval function, the function interprets it as a number and returns the floating point version, which in this case would be 45.67 as a float. The result is then stored in floatvar, which you can freely use in mathematical expressions, comparisons, or database operations. This method is especially useful when dealing with user inputs, text files, or API responses, where numeric data might come in as text. By applying the floatval function, you ensure that the value is safely and correctly converted into a numerical format. Unlike implicit conversion, which happens automatically, Using floatval gives you clear control and makes your code more readable and predictable. In most real-world applications, developers use floatval to clean up and standardize data before performing calculations. It's a quick, reliable way to make sure your variables hold valid numeric types, avoiding any unexpected behavior that could occur if PHP tried to interpret text values on its own. Another simple and effective method to convert a string into a float in PHP is by using typecasting. Typecasting gives the developer direct control over how data is interpreted by explicitly defining the type you want to convert it into. Unlike automatic conversion, which PHP performs behind the scenes, typecasting requires you to manually specify the target type. This makes your code more predictable and ensures that the conversion happens exactly as intended. The syntax for typecasting is very straightforward. You simply write float or double before the variable that you want to convert. For example, the syntax floatvar, float stringvar, explicitly tells PHP to take the value stored in stringvar and convert it into a floating point number, storing the result in floatvar. This approach works not only for numeric strings, but also for values that PHP can interpret as numbers, such as integers or Boolean values. One major advantage of using typecasting is that it makes your intentions clear in the code. Anyone reading your script will immediately understand that you are converting a value to a specific data type on purpose, rather than relying on PHP's automatic behavior. It also helps avoid unexpected results that might occur when PHP implicitly converts values in complex expressions. For example, if you have a string like 12345, casting it to float will convert it to the numeric value 123.5, allowing you to perform arithmetic operations directly. Similarly, if the string does not contain a valid numeric value, the cast will result in 0, which can help prevent errors in mathematical calculations. In summary, typecasting is a clean and explicit way to convert data in PHP. By using float variable, you ensure accuracy, clarity, and control in your code. It's a best practice to use this method whenever you need guaranteed type conversion, especially in financial, mathematical, or data processing applications where precision and reliability are important. Now let's take a look at Code Snippet 22, which shows a simple and practical example of how the floatval function works in PHP. In this example, we start by creating a variable named str and assigning it a value that looks like a floating point number, but it's actually stored as a string, 15689943. Because this value is enclosed in quotation marks, PHP treats it as text rather than a number. Next, we use the floatval function to convert that string into a proper floating point number. The code converted das floatval str tells PHP to take the value inside a str, interpret it as a numeric value, and return its floating point equivalent. This converted number is then stored in a new variable called converted. Finally, we use the var dump converted function to display the result along with its data type. The output we see is float 15.689943, which clearly shows that PHP has successfully converted the string into a float. The number inside the parentheses confirms that the value is now a floating point type and can be used for arithmetic operations, comparisons, or other numerical calculations. This example is a perfect illustration of how the floatval function makes it easy to convert text-based numeric values into real numbers in PHP. It's especially useful when dealing with data received from user input forms, databases, or APIs, where numbers are often stored as strings. By applying floatval, you can ensure your data is properly formatted and ready for precise mathematical processing. In short, this code snippet demonstrates that even though PHP can automatically handle many type conversions, using functions like floatval gives you more control, clarity, and reliability in your code. It makes your program safer and more predictable, especially when handling mixed or uncertain data types. Now that we've seen how to convert strings into floats, let's move to the next important concept: casting strings and floats to integers in PHP. In many programming scenarios, it becomes necessary to convert a numeric value from one type to another. For instance, you might have a floating point number or a numeric string, but for a specific operation, like counting items, working with database IDs, or performing integer-based calculations, you need that value to be in integer form. PHP makes this process simple and flexible by providing several ways to convert values into integers. There are three main methods you can use for this purpose: int, integer, and the intval function. The first two, int and integer, are different in syntax but identical in functionality. They are explicit typecasting operators that force the value to be converted into an integer. When you use either of these, PHP truncates the decimal part of a number and keeps only the whole number portion. For example, if you cast the float 1298 to an integer, the result will be 12. This behavior is useful when you only need the integer component of a value. The third method is the intval function, which performs the same task but works as a built-in function rather than a casting operator. You pass the value you want to convert as a parameter, and it returns the corresponding integer. The syntax is simple: intval variable, and it's particularly useful when you want to ensure the conversion happens explicitly within a function call, making your code more readable and expressive. All three methods are commonly used in PHP depending on the developer's preference and the structure of the code. The casting operators are faster and more direct, while the intval function is more descriptive and often used in data validation or filtering processes. For instance, when working with form inputs or URL parameters, using intval helps ensure the received data is safely converted to an integer before use. In the next example, code snippet 23, we'll see a practical demonstration of how PHP converts both floating point and string values into integers using these techniques. This will help you visualize how the conversion works and what kind of output you can expect when using each method in your own scripts. All right, guys, now that you understand how the floatval function works and how PHP automatically handles type conversions, let's take it one step further. You've seen how we can easily turn strings into floating point numbers, but what if you want to go in the opposite direction? What if you need to convert a float or even a numeric string into an integer manually? That's exactly what we'll explore in the next lesson, Code Snippet 23, where we'll learn how to cast floating point and string values into integers using different methods, including int, integer, and the intval function. It's a simple but very useful concept that helps you manage data more precisely, especially in calculations, database queries, and number-based operations. So make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next lesson in this PHP tutorial series. Trust me, you'll want to see how these conversions work in real examples. I'll see you in the next video. Code Snippet 23.